The snow on the mountain muffled everything. Footsteps, voices, even fear. Only the wind moved freely, sweeping over the Berghof's rooftops and rattling the shutters like a warning the house never heeded. In the pre-dawn darkness, the maid hurried through the silent hallway, carrying a folded blanket pressed to her chest. Her breath fogged the air. Her hands shook. She didn't know yet what she would find behind his door, but the sounds had already burned themselves into her memory. A crash, a sharp cry, a frantic, muffled argument between the adjutants, and underneath it all, a single, ragged voice that didn't sound like a dictator at all, just a man drowning inside his own body. When she reached the end of the corridor, 2 officers were already there, struggling to push the door closed as something crashed again inside. She froze. Her heart thudded painfully against her ribs. A single thought pulsed through her mind. Not again. The door shuddered with another impact. One adjutant pressed his shoulder to it, while the other hissed, "Hold it! Doctor's coming down the stairs!" The maid backed into the shadows, blanket clutched tight. She had learned how to disappear when the night took this shape. When the doctor finally arrived, breathless, hair wild, bag swinging from his hand, he pushed past her, without acknowledgement, and slipped inside. The door slammed shut. The hallway fell silent, except for the wind tapping against the glass. Then she heard it. His voice. Not booming like it did in speeches, not disciplined like it did at meetings, but cracked, trembling, furious at a pain nobody else could feel. The sound unsettled her deepest bones. She had served in houses where tempers ran high, where men cursed and shouted, where shame rattled the cupboards late at night. But this was different. This voice belonged to a man whose fear had the power to reshape continents. After what felt like hours, the shouting waned. The doctor emerged, face pale, hands trembling. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. Anyone who lived on the mountain long enough recognized that hollow look. The adjutants followed, red-eyed and shaken. Then he stepped out. Adolf Hitler leaned against the door frame, breathing hard, sweat glistening at his temples. His nightshirt clung to him, his hair stuck to his forehead. His hands trembled as he raised one to wipe his mouth. For a moment, he stood there like a man waking from a nightmare that had followed him into the waking world. The maid kept her eyes down, but she felt his presence like a physical weight pressing into her lungs. He straightened abruptly, pulled the nightshirt tight around his thin frame, and walked past her with a startling calm, his footsteps measured, his posture perfectly upright, as if he had just returned from a quiet sleep instead of an explosive collapse. She remained frozen long after he disappeared down the stairs. Hours later, the sun rose and the house returned to its curated cheerfulness. Children from the village arrived carrying small gifts, hand-carved toys, baskets of apples. Hoffmann, the court photographer, followed with his equipment. The dogs bounded through the snow, barking joyfully. Hitler appeared on the terrace in a fresh uniform, smiling as if the night had never happened. He bent down to speak to the smallest child, brushing snow from her coat sleeve, the shepherd dog circling his legs. His voice was soft, his expression gentle. The maid watched from the doorway, the memory of the night still burning in her chest. She realized then that the world only ever saw this version, the smiling uncle, the dog lover, the man who claimed to be too simple for luxury, too moral for indulgence, too pure for vice. No one saw the way his hands trembled when he poured tea. No one saw the panic in his eyes when the pain hit. No one saw the fear that consumed him when the lights went out. The camera stopped clicking. The children waved goodbye. The officers returned to their duties. The dogs retreated to their kennels. And Hitler returned to the great window overlooking the Alps, the place where he spoke most freely, because he believed the mountains owed him their silence. He stood there for a long time, hands clasped behind his back, breathing slowly. The maid stepped quietly into the room to collect the empty cups. She kept her head low, hoping he wouldn't notice her. But when she passed behind him, he murmured something so softly, she wasn't sure she heard it correctly. "Purity," he whispered to the glass. Her blood turned cold. After lunch, the monotony resumed. He ate boiled vegetables grown in the Berghof's greenhouses, picking at them with delicate precision. His stomach was a battlefield, one he approached with far more caution than any he commanded on maps. Every meal was vetted twice, every utensil polished to shine, every plate checked for contamination. He refused rich foods. He refused meat. He refused anything he hadn't personally approved. The staff exchanged silent glances as they worked. Everyone knew he feared poison more than bullets. Everyone knew he feared disease more than defeat. And everyone knew he feared betrayal more than he feared the Allies. The doctor returned in the afternoon. Hitler closed the door behind him. Their voices drifted through the heavy wood, Hitler demanding stronger pills, the doctor insisting his dosage was already dangerously high. A bottle clinked, papers rustled, a chair scraped across the floor. When the doctor finally left, his face was drained of all color. That evening, Hitler summoned his officers for discussion. They gathered in the main room, posture tight, boots polished, maps rolled under their arms. The maid stood against the wall with a tray of tea, her presence unnoticed but always necessary. The discussion began calmly, then shifted, then darkened. His voice grew sharper. His hands moved in erratic arcs. His breathing quickened. He ranted about the weakness of the world. He ranted about the fragility of bloodlines. He ranted about enemies hidden in shadows. The maid watched one officer swallow hard, his throat bobbing visibly as Hitler leaned closer and demanded total loyalty. Not to Germany, not to the people, but to him. Another hour passed before the meeting ended. When the officers stood, one remained behind, not by choice. His legs shook so violently he had to lean against the wall for support. The maid helped him sit on a nearby chair. He stared at the floor, mouth slightly open, breath shallow. "He's not well," the officer whispered. The maid said nothing. "He speaks to us like we're disobedient sons," the officer continued, and then, 5 minutes later, he feeds a dog from his own hand. His voice cracked. He looked at her. He wasn't seeking conversation. He was seeking sanity. But she had none to offer. That night, the maid returned to her room near the staff quarters. She placed her candle on the dresser and sat on the edge of her bed, pushing her fingers against her temples. She had been on the mountain for less than 6 months. She felt 10 years older. A distant bark echoed through the valley. The wind howled against the shutters, and in the faint glow of the candle, she saw something on her sleeve, a small smear of ash from the fireplace she had cleaned earlier. She brushed it away and lay down, but sleep did not come quickly. She could still hear him shouting. She could still see him smiling. She could not reconcile the two. And the most frightening thought of all crept into her mind. Maybe he didn't reconcile them either. Before we go deeper, I want to pause, just for a moment. Because the stories we're telling aren't about military tactics or political doctrines. They're about people. The staff who walked those hallways, the officers who watched their leader unravel, the children who smiled for photographs without knowing the truth. If you want more human-centered stories like this, stories that peel back the myth and confront the actual experience, make sure you subscribe. We explore these lives every day, not to glorify history, but to understand the people trapped inside it. And tell me this in the comments. Where are you listening from right now? Hitler's mountain felt like the center of the world to the people trapped in it, but your perspective matters just as much. Whether you're in London, Mumbai, Toronto, or a long bus ride somewhere quiet, your voice helps keep these stories alive. Now, back to the mountain. The next morning began like all others, metallic chime of breakfast dishes, muffled steps of attendants, the distant bark of dogs awaiting their handlers. But something felt heavier in the air. The maid noticed it when she entered the dining room. Hitler sat at the table with a sheet of paper in his hand. His face was unreadable, but the tension in the room was unmistakable. 2 officers stood nearby, shifting uncomfortably. The maid lowered her head and began arranging plates. She tried not to look, but curiosity, fear, and duty braided together inside her, pulling her attention back to that paper. Hitler finally spoke. "It seems," he said quietly, "the Americans believe they understand me." He held up the document. The officer closest to him cleared his throat. "It's an analysis, mein Führer, psychological in nature, compiled by an American intelligence unit. We intercepted it." The maid stopped moving. Her fingers tightened around the edge of a plate. Hitler unfolded the paper slowly, eyes narrowing. The room was silent, except for a faint ticking from the clock on the wall. Then he began to read. His expression changed, subtly at first, then visibly. A twitch in the jaw, a tightening around the eyes, a sudden involuntary tick in his cheek. The more he read, the darker his face became. The officer shifted again. "They say that you are driven by paranoia, that your leadership stems from psychological instability. They even predict that you would rather die than surrender." Hitler froze. The paper trembled in his hand. He lifted his eyes, and then he laughed. A brittle, splintering laugh that made the maid's stomach knot. It wasn't amusement. It wasn't disbelief. It was the sound of a man who recognized a truth he could not tolerate. He slammed the papers onto the table. The maid flinched. "They know nothing," he spat. "Nothing!" His hand shook as he pushed himself upright. "They think I will fall as lesser men do? They think they can write my destiny on paper like a school lesson?" He paced the room, talking to the walls, to the officers, to himself. "They think they can predict the will of history, the will of a nation? They are fools." He stopped at the window and pressed both hands against the cold glass. "They do not understand purity," he whispered. "They never have." The maid felt a chill run the length of her spine. This was the moment the staff would later say everything changed. He folded the paper and set it aside as if it burned him. The officers collected themselves with faces smoothed over, practicing the neutral expressions that had kept them alive this long. The maid moved to clear the table, feeling as though she'd just helped sweep ash from the hearth of a house already half burned. Days passed with the same ritual of contradiction. In the mornings he would stroll among the greenhouses, fingers tracing the neatly spaced rows of cabbages and leeks like a man tending a small, fragile country of his own. He would inhale deeply and remark on the sweetness of a carrot, almost tender in the way he described it, as if the proper color of a root could prove the moral worth of a nation. And in the evenings he returned to his study to sharpen his hate into commands. The same hands that pinched baby cheeks for the camera also signed orders that widened the circle of suffering he imagined responsible for his illness. A week later, the maid found herself summoned to a small room on the edge of the staff wing. An adjutant, younger than the others and new enough to still show cracks, when frightened, leaned against a table and stared at his boots. His name was Klaus. He had been an ardent believer when he arrived, bright-eyed, eager, now worn down by too many nights of witnessing the same eruption and the same false serenity afterward. "They sent word from Berlin," Klaus said quietly when she stepped inside. "There's been talk. People are whispering about replacements, in case—" His voice failed. He rubbed his forehead with the heel of his hand, the way tired men do when they can't fix what's breaking. "Replacements for whom?" she asked, though she already understood. The mountain replaced everything when it needed to. Faces, loyalties, even names. For him, for if things get worse. Klaus's eyes flicked to the door to make sure no one else heard. "It's not good. They don't like that he speaks like he does in private." The maid nodded slowly. She kept her reply practical. "We keep doing our work," she said. "We keep the dogs fed. We keep the linens clean. We keep the lights off when he asks." Klaus laughed once, a sound too brittle to be real. "We keep alive." He tapped the table. "That's what we're doing, keeping alive." That afternoon an officer the maid rarely saw, a colonel from Berlin, older, stern, whose reputation suggested a man who had learned the price of power, requested an audience with her. He stood awkwardly in the kitchen doorway, removing his gloves with slow, deliberate motions, as if that small act tethered him to the present. He watched the staff move like clockwork, preparing tea, mending a sock, stacking plates. "You work here long?" he asked without preamble. Just months, Herr Oberst, she answered. He studied her face, then nodded. And you see much. She hesitated. Honesty in the Berghof was dangerous. Yet, something in the colonel's worn face, an exhaustion that had nothing to do with the mountain cold, made her speak with a rawer honesty than she intended. We see his two faces, she said. The face for cameras, the face for nights. The colonel let out a breath that might have been a laugh once, but had been hollowed by time. I've been taking reports up to the general staff, he admitted. They assume the public facade cannot change. It can. People can change. He shook his head. It's the private cracks that matter. Those are the dangerous ones. What will they do? She asked. He looked away toward the window that framed the gray-blue slope of an untroubled mountain beyond. In Berlin, the concern is if the Führer's condition becomes a liability, but there is also fear that any move against him could trigger more than a loss of leadership. It could become chaos. A man like him, he stopped, choosing his words, a man who believes his pain justifies everything, is hard to remove without breaking the thing he holds together. She thought then of the children on the terrace, the tiny hands clutching dog's fur, the way they laughed at a joke he told. She thought of the officer who had left in the middle of the night after a teacup was broken. She thought of the paper that had made him laugh like a man seeing his own shadow and deciding to embrace it. The colonel continued. There are men who would act if the orders come. There are men who will look the other way, out of loyalty, out of cowardice, out of fear. This mountain breeds all those men. A week later, the maid watched one of those small, human dramas unfold. A medic arrived from the city with a young soldier, the boy barely out of his teens, whose face had been smacked by some blunt object and whose nerves were shot. They set him in a chair in the corridor, bandaged his bruise, and offered him water. He sat quiet and glancing about, eyes huge. A child from the village wandered by, drawn by the figure wrapped in a bandage. She peered in, curious, the way children are curious about anything wounded. The boy managed a weak smile and reached out with a shaking hand. The child, without hesitation, placed a small wooden toy into his palm, a gesture as natural as breath. The maid watched them, her chest tightening. Moments later, an SS aide walked past and threw the boy a sharp look. The soldiers who had brought him in glanced away. They had been told not to draw attention, not to show weakness. That night, the soldiers ate in a separate room. The maid slipped past and saw the boy sitting alone in a corner, holding the toy and tracing its carved edges with a finger. He had seen horrors, and yet he treasured that small kindness like a relic. The maid thought of how easy it is to honor tenderness in private and betray it in policy. These micro-moments were the ones that stitched the staff together, tiny acts of humanity that did not require permission from men in uniform. They were also the moments that made the house feel unbearable, a place where warmth arrived in pinpricks while cruelty operated in sweeping policies. The war pressed closer. Reports from the front grew worse. The maid learned of retreats, of cities being bombed, of convoys halted, of supplies depleted. She learned of names that became numbers, and numbers that became graves. The Berghof's radios began to air more alarming bulletins. Yet the mountain rituals continued. Gardens were tended, films were watched in the evening, dogs learned new tricks. The contradiction hardened into a strange form of normal. Then came the night the maid knew would be written about long after the mountain fell. A night when the mask slipped so far it could not be stitched back on. It began with an innocuous argument over a map. Staff in the office were coordinating troop placements while Hitler, as was his habit, drifted into the conversation like a vagrant thought. He did not press for logistical details so much as metaphors. "We must cut out the rot," he said. "We must cleanse." His voice had the slow heat of someone warming to a pyre. One of the officers, young, principled, weary, objected. He used the words civilians and morality in the same breath. It sounded old-fashioned. It sounded dangerous. Hitler's reaction was immediate and animal. He rose from his chair and walked over to the map as if it had insulted him. He pointed sharply at locations, as if his finger were a scalpel. His voice rose to a pitch that made glass tremble. The room contracted around his rage. "Morality," he spat. "Talk to me about morality after our people have bled for their land? What morality are you speaking of? The world has been rotten for so long. My duty is to prune." The officer held his ground. "Not at the price of innocent lives, Herr Führer. Not when there are alternatives." For a breathless moment, the staff watched two worlds collide. Then Hitler leaned in, face inches from the officer, and spoke slowly, as if tasting each word. "You speak of innocent lives as if they are separate from the destiny of the nation. They are not. They are material. They are part of the calculus. The nation's purity requires sacrifice. Some will be taken. Some will be spared. That is history." The officer's face went white. He had not expected the argument to be met with philosophical dismissal. He swallowed, voice hoarse. He left the room minutes later, head down. The maid watched him pass and saw tears on his cheek, barely visible in the flicker of lamplight. Afterward, the maid found herself standing by the terrace, watching the stars as if they could offer answers. The wind smelled faintly of wood smoke and damp earth. She thought back to Murray's report that had been read aloud at the breakfast table, a document that had predicted self-destruction, that had named the man's neuroses, that had concluded with a forecast of catastrophic resolve if cornered. She thought about the officer who had just left, about the boy with the wooden toy, about the colonel who feared both action and inaction. She understood then a truth she hadn't fully allowed herself to admit. The Berghof wasn't merely a house supporting a leader. It supported a myth. Remove the myth and something worse might spill out, an abyss of conviction that justified almost any brutality in the name of a higher cause. But inertia is powerful. Institutions do not unwind overnight. It is easier to keep tending gardens than to answer whether you would have stood up and said no if you had been there when the orders were signed. It is easier to feed dogs than to count the dead. It is easier to keep silent. Days later, a small, almost trivial incident exposed how thin the veil was. A seam in a curtain unraveled. Someone, no one ever admitted who, had mended it hastily. The next morning, a man who handled the heating returned a coal bucket to the storeroom and found the mending needle left on the bench. He joked about carelessness in a tone meant to deflect fear, but his hands betrayed him. That afternoon he was gone, sent away, discharged, transferred in a manner wordless and definitive. The maid began to notice the pattern. A small mistake, a question asked too loudly, a teacup dropped. And then, within a day or two, a missing person. No explanations, no formal charges. One morning their room would be empty. The next, the corridor would whisper their absence like a secret. She started to keep a ledger in her mind, names of those who disappeared, the dates, the last words she heard. It became an exercise in survival, a way to name the unnameable. The list grew. One bitter, wind-lashed evening, he gathered a handful of staff in the drawing room to watch a film. The projectionist fed the reel, and the room fell into darkness, save for the glow on the screen. For an hour, in that dim light, the house lived a fragile, ordinary joy. Laughter rose at a comedic line. A child clapped excitedly. For a few breaths, the mountain felt human. When the film ended, the light returned. The maid rose to collect cups. As she passed the sofa, she heard him murmur under his breath, a sentence meant for no audience but heard by everyone. "It's a pity," he said, voice soft. "When greatness meets cowardice, the world must be remade." No one answered. Plates scraped in the kitchen. A dog whined in the hall. Someone coughed. Outside, far below where the roads wound into the valley, a town burned that night. The maid would read the name in the paper days later, and perhaps associate it with the flick of his wrist as he described remaking the world. She would watch the news and see faces she remembered from the village list. She would think, privately and with a nauseous clarity, that the stage on the mountain had always been a theater of consent, where small acts of complicity paved the way for catastrophe. Weeks later, the staff awoke to the sound of distant sirens. The war, which had always been a headline at the bottom of the paper, became present in the bones. The Berghof's windows rattled. The dogs bolted for the yard, whimpering. Orders came down from higher up to prepare for a possible evacuation. The maid packed a small bundle with trembling hands, the same movement soldiers had been making for years, and kept in her pocket the wooden toy the boy had been given, a talisman of stubborn kindness. There was a change then, not sudden but noticeable. The laughter in the projection room grew thinner, the jokes were flatter, and the officers who had once smiled easily at the table found their expressions growing skeptical, irritated, impatient. The colonel who'd confided in the maid began to spend more time by the maps, poring over lines and routes with a face sharpened by worry instead of bravado. The mountain remained beautiful, indifferent, its peaks unyielding. Below, the world fractured in ways that would not be undone. When the night finally arrived, the night the maid had anticipated, dreaded, and tried to steer away from, she stood at the threshold of the great room and watched as the man who had taught dogs to carry sticks and children to smile pushed the house toward its end. Something terrible was happening, and the mountain was listening. He entered the great room without warning, moving quickly enough that the officers straightened, like rifles snapping to attention. His face held that familiar tension, a stretched, brittle calm that looked like a mask plastered over a storm. The maid, still at the doorway, froze in place. She recognized that particular stillness in him. It never ended well. He moved to the center of the room, palms flat on the polished table. The air tightened. The officers watched his knuckles whiten. The dogs, usually bold around him, slunk back toward the shadows. The maid pressed herself against the wood paneling, breath shallow, fingers cold. "What did Berlin say?" His voice was low. No one answered at first. There was too much risk in the truth, too much danger in the lie. Finally, General Bormann cleared his throat. "Reports suggest the Americans have crossed the line at Remagen. The bridge still stands." Hitler closed his eyes. It was impossible to read his mind, yet everyone sensed the shift, a pivot from anger to something darker. He reached slowly for the chair behind him, lowering himself with deliberate control, as if even gravity needed to submit to his authority. "Fools," he whispered, "every one of them." The maid felt the hairs on her arms rise. He opened his eyes again, sharper now, feverish. "We are surrounded by weakness, doubt, cowardice." His voice tightened with each word. "If the nation collapses, it will not be the Allies who break it." He pointed to his own staff. "It will be the rot within." The words hit the room like a blow. A few officers flinched. One stared at the floor, hands clenched. The maid held perfectly still. He leaned back, fingers tapping the armrest. Everything must be purged. Everything unclean. Everything treacherous. His voice trembled, not with fear, but with conviction. "I shall do it myself if no one else has the courage." In that moment, the maid understood something chilling. The American psychological report hadn't insulted him. It had given him language, terrifying, validating language, to weaponize. He rose from the chair and paced. His footsteps echoed sharply, the heels striking the wood like the ticking of a bomb. He spoke to no one, and everyone, hands slicing the air, his breath growing more ragged. "I have given this nation everything," he muttered. "My body, my health, my youth. But they take, always betray. They doubt my vision, my purity, my sacrifice." A violent cough seized him. He gripped the edge of the table, shoulders shaking. The officers rushed forward, but he waved them back with a snarl. The maid saw his face tighten. His lips moved silently, forming words she could not hear. His hand slid under the collar of his tunic, scratching at the skin as if something beneath it tormented him. When the coughing stopped, he straightened. His eyes carried a sheen of something otherworldly, part pain, part certainty, part delusion. "We will not surrender," he said. "We will not negotiate. If Germany falls, it will fall purified. Better to burn the world than yield to contamination." A long silence followed. No one breathed. And then, without warning, Hitler turned sharply and left the room. His footsteps faded. The door slammed. The spell broke. Officers inhaled. One sat heavily in a chair. Another pinched the bridge of his nose. A third whispered a curse under his breath. The maid stepped forward to gather discarded papers, her hands trembling. As she did, the young officer from earlier, Klaus, approached her with eyes hollowed by fear. "This is the end," he said quietly. "He isn't planning to defend Germany. He's planning to punish it." She had no reply. He continued, voice barely audible. "Did you hear him? If the Allies break through, he'll destroy the bridges, the cities, the factories, everything. A nation of ashes." The maid stared down at the scattered papers, maps, notes, erratic scribbles in a hand that had grown less steady each month. She gathered them carefully, afraid of touching madness itself. That evening, the Berghof sank into a tense silence. The dogs wouldn't settle, pacing as if they sensed something coming. The officers remained at their desks, pretending to work while stewing in dread. The mountain, usually serene, felt wounded, its wind sharp, its shadows longer. Late in the night, the maid heard footsteps outside her room, heavy, slow, unsteady. She cracked her door open and peered into the corridor. Hitler stood alone in the dim blue light. No officers, no dogs, no shadowing guards. He leaned against the wall, one hand pressed to his abdomen, the other gripping the railing. Sweat darkened his collar. His breathing rattled. His face twisted with pain. Only the empty hallway was meant to witness. The maid held to her breath. He whispered something. She strained to hear. He repeated it. Betrayal. Then he straightened, wiped his mouth with a shaking hand, and walked on. The maid closed her door and sank to the floor, her heart pounding. She realized what she had just seen. A man broken by illness. A leader unraveling in private. A dictator more afraid of his own body than any invading army. And yet, somehow, still possessed by the conviction that the world should bow to his suffering. The following morning brought the sound of trucks climbing the mountain road. Engines growled, radios crackled, soldiers barked orders. The Berghof, once a palace of fake tranquility, was transforming into a bunker. Hitler summoned the staff. He stood at the head of the great hall, flanked by maps and folders and a fury that permeated the air like smoke. "We prepare for collapse," he announced, "and if collapse comes, we will not allow our enemies a functioning nation to inherit." The maid's stomach twisted. Around her, faces blanched. No one dared look at one another. He paced, hands clasped tightly behind his back. "Everything is to be destroyed. Bridges, railways, power stations, food stores, factories." He turned sharply. "Let them inherit ruins." The room was silent. He studied them, staff, officers, aides, as if searching for defiance. His gaze landed on one of the cooks. The man's jaw trembled visibly. Hitler stepped closer, staring straight into the man's fear. "You understand," he said softly. "Sacrifice is noble. Pain is noble. Purity is noble. Weakness is not." The cook nodded desperately. Hitler smiled, a small, chilling smile, and the maid understood the truth. This was the version of him the world never saw. Not the smiling uncle of Hoffman's photographs. Not the dog lover feeding biscuits to shepherds. Not the vegetarian ordering peas and boiled cabbage. This was the man who justified annihilation with a whisper. The house was no longer a home. It was an executioner's chamber waiting for its cue. That night, as the staff prepared to sleep, distant explosions echoed in the valley. Not thunder, demolition charges. Hitler had begun destroying his own infrastructure. The officers gathered on the terrace, listening as cities burned far beyond the mountain. Klaus appeared beside the maid, trembling. He stared into the darkness, as if he could see the country tearing itself apart. "He'll take everyone with him," Klaus murmured numbly. "He'll drag the entire nation into the grave." The maid swallowed hard. "Will you leave?" Klaus shook his head. "If I flee, I'm a traitor. If I stay, I help him finish what he's begun. Tell me, what choice is that?" His voice cracked. How do you save a nation from a man who thinks the nation must die with him? The maid had no answer, and that silence, the helpless, suffocating silence, was the last truth the mountain ever held. In the weeks that followed, the Berghof emptied like a ship too damaged to sail. Officers were reassigned, staff disappeared without farewells. Soldiers who had once guarded the terrace now packed their gear hurriedly, throwing frightened glances at the house they had once revered. Hitler himself retreated deeper into his isolation. He ate less, slept less, ranted more. His body failed him visibly, tremors worsening, voice thinning, breath shortened. His hands shook so violently he often spilled water lifting a glass. And yet, even as his body betrayed him, his certainty fed on the collapse around him. He spoke of destiny, of sacrifice, of purity through destruction. He claimed the world had rejected him. Therefore, he would reject the world. Then came the final order. The staff gathered in the main hall as an adjutant read aloud Hitler's command to execute the scorched earth plan in full. No hesitation, no exceptions. Germany was to be reduced to ashes. A murmur ran through the room, not loud, but unmistakable. Fear, horror, disbelief. Even for those who had supported him faithfully, this crossed a threshold they had never imagined. One officer stepped forward, older, trembling but resolute. His voice was soft when he finally spoke. "This will destroy our people." The adjutant stiffened. "It is the Führer's will." The officer lifted his chin. "Then he is no longer serving Germany." He was escorted out quietly, permanently. The maid watched him disappear through the doorway. She pressed a hand to her chest, feeling a sudden, overwhelming grief. Not just for him, but for all the silent ones who had lived between obedience and conscience until both collapsed. That night, the Berghof shook again with distant detonations. The mountains absorbed the sound like a secret. Soldiers deserted their posts. Officers fled under the cover of darkness. The colonel who had spoken to the maid vanished with a single suitcase. Klaus packed quickly, left a note on his cot, and walked down the winding path alone. Within days, the house stood nearly empty. Hitler gave no farewell to the mountain he claimed to love. He departed with a small entourage, descending toward the bunker in Berlin, the place he believed history would record as his final temple. The maid watched his car disappear around the bend. Only then did she allow herself to breathe freely for the first time in months. The house felt enormous without him, echoing, chilled, stripped of its delusions. A place that had once hosted kings and dictators now felt like a shell of rotting grandeur. She walked the terrace one last time, touching the cold stone railing where children had once giggled while Hoffman's camera clicked. The dog's paw prints were fading in the last patches of snow. The mountains rose tall and silent, unchanged by the man who thought he owned them. She understood something then, something she would carry for the rest of her life. The world never sees the private shape of a tyrant's madness. Only the people trapped closest to him do. The staff, the adjutants, the officers who watched him unravel in real time. And those people lived in a prison the world could never fully imagine. She left the Berghof quietly, carrying only a small suitcase and the carved wooden toy she refused to abandon. She didn't look back. The mountain didn't either. When the war finally ended, newspapers printed the headlines: Hitler dead, Berlin fallen, Europe liberated. But none of those headlines captured the truth she knew, that before the world collapsed around him, Hitler had collapsed inside himself. And everything that followed was the shrapnel of that internal ruin. The tyrant died in a bunker, but the madman had lived on the mountain, and the mountain had witnessed every moment,